Hi folks, with Tacitus Today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio radio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about sort of the last year, if you like, of or the last 10 or 11 months of World War II in Europe, and the British and American and Canadian landings on the coast of France. Heading towards Germany were successful, an established foothold there. The Red Army of the Soviet Union was moving towards Germany, and the British and American forces and some Polish forces, I understand, in Italy were driving up through Italy, hopefully getting into Austria and Germany and so on. So it's a three front war, round the clock bombing. And you'd think at this stage that the jig was up, and Hitler and his senior advisors would decide that, hey, we better see what we can do to cut a deal or something with these guys, and prevent the direct invasion of Germany and so on. But instead, Hitler clung to the view that the war actually was still winnable. Now, with hindsight, we can look at that and say, well, that was insane, but was it? So this essay is to examine the considerations that Hitler and his closest advisors and so on were the thoughts they had, the considerations they had, the views they had, the discussions they had, and to look at why did they think the war was still winnable when, just on a prima facie basis at least, that the situation appeared hopeless, or beyond hopeless even, but they didn't see it that way. And so let's go through some of those. Now, I should point out, I guess, a couple of things here, that when the British, Americans and Canadians landed in France, it was called the D-Day landings in June 1944. They had complete control of the sea. The British Navy had complete control of the sea. The American and British Air Force had complete control of the air, and so they had complete cover. The Luftwaffe was just nowhere in sight, or certainly not in any appreciable numbers. And if a Luftwaffe aircraft showed its propeller, then it was being vigorously chased by a lot of other British or American aircraft. So, but in spite of that, the landing was touch and go for the British and Americans, and the casualties are quite heavy. Now, this is notable given that the other than some tank divisions, some armored divisions that were moved into the area, most of the troops, nearly all the troops that they were facing on the German side, at least, that they were facing were older men, men in their mid-40s or older even, men with a missing arm or a missing leg. So these weren't the top quality frontline troops. The best quality troops were all fighting the Red Army in the east. So in spite of it, complete air control and cover of the control of the oceans and the seas, and in spite of the fact that they were facing typically, with some exceptions, but typically older handicapped men, it still was touch and go for a couple of weeks. But once they got the foothold in there, and once the ports were established and the supplies were flowing in, then the outcome was obvious. They were there to stay. Now, apart from one heart-stopping moment in what was called the Battle of the Bulge and through the Ardennes forest, when it was a close-run thing, that the Wehrmacht would issue another defeat to the British and Americans. But really, these were the things that Hitler and again his advisors were looking at. They were looking at the quality of the British and American forces was quite low, and the Germans were better trained, better equipped, better led, better organised, and in the whole had better equipment. In spite of the bombing being very disruptive on German industrial production. So they weren't that concerned about the British and Americans. They thought they could defeat them. Now, if they could have quickly defeated the British and Americans, but bear in mind that there was some 1.5 million Wehrmacht troops that were stationed all across like Norway and France and Italy, and in fact a bit more than that, probably close to 1.8 million at a time. Now these aren't top quality troops. Again, a lot of guys in their 40s and so on, but they can do all the work in the background and the supply and all that sort of stuff, and release the other younger men for frontline duties. So that 1.8 million was a huge. If they could have moved all of those guys over to the east, then they could have, I think, reasonably easily defeated the Red Army. So just tying down that many troops was in itself something that was contributing very much to the difficult Wehrmacht situation against the Red Army in the east. So Hitler had a number of considerations. He didn't think the quality of the opposition was that high and they could be defeated. Now you can debate that and say, well, they weren't that bad and so on. But the great victories that were supposedly won by the British and Americans coming through France and into the east were won against very depleted, older men with poorer quality equipment, less resources and so on. In addition to that, the British and American air forces could interdict any attempt to move troops or supply, unless it was at night, troops or supplies in any direction, and that also had a big effect. Where there was a confrontation between front line Wehrmacht troops and British or Americans, then the Wehrmacht won pretty much every time, even in the West. So Hitler's assessment was right there, but was it a decisive factor? Well, no, of course not. There were just too many forces, numerically and material-wise, ranged against the Wehrmacht at that time. So that wasn't a material point, as much as Hitler kept referring to it. Now, the other thing was that there were three weapons projects that the German engineers had worked on, and one of them was a jet engine for the jet fighter. Now, they successfully developed the jet engine, and they had teething problems, as you'd expect with such a new technology, but they successfully developed the jet engine, which was later on would become the basis for the American NASA landings on the moon in 1969. But at the time, these jet engines were developed, and they could have a jet fighter that could travel at just over 500 miles, about 800 kilometers an hour, which was, you look at the fastest planes around at the time were about 350 miles an hour, and that was with no bombs or nothing. That was a really cut down sort of version of the plane. So 500, just over 500 miles an hour was serious speed advantage and very maneuverable as well. Now, when this was explained to Hitler, Hitler decided that he wanted a bomber. Well, anything that fast, we should make a bomber. Then it can go in, bomb the crap out of wherever, and then be too fast to shoot down. The other fighter planes can't get to it, so then it comes back unscathed, so we don't lose any planes, but we can still bomb the crap out of the other guys with impunity. Now, it was explained to Hitler, well, no, that's not right. That the way these engines have been designed and made and the plane structured is it's got to be light, and that's the only way it can be fast. You stick bombs on it, it loses its maneuverability. It's not as fast. It needs bigger fuel tanks, which adds more weight and so on. But Hitler had this idea of because Germany was being bombed quite heavily at that time, that, well, let's bomb them back. And we've got our master. We've got now an ace in the hole that we can do this. So in spite of his advisors, some people that he would normally listen to, saying, no, let's stick with a fighter, because the American and British bombing of German industry at the time was quite intense. So the idea was, if there was a fighter that could move, a jet fighter that could travel at these speeds and carry plenty of bullets, but not bombs, then it would take a very heavy toll of the bombers, and so as a result, they'd have to either back off of the bombing effort or accept casualties. Now, the casualties that the Americans and British were suffering just from anti-aircraft fire and some of the intermittent fighter involvement, they were already having discussions of, should we back off on this bombing? It's becoming too costly in terms of lost aircraft and lost crews that are quite well trained, the bombardiers and all this sort of stuff. So it was a close run thing even then. So if there'd been the German industry could have turned out 200, 250 fighters a month from early 1944 if Hitler hadn't interfered and wanted the bomber instead of the fighter. Then he changed his mind back again and said, well, how about a hybrid fighter bomber? Then by the time he did accept that hey, let's have a fighter, then it was kind of too late to really do anything of substance. But had Hitler acted decisively at the time, and he still had this in mind in the middle of 1944, that it could still be done, then it could have made quite a difference. If that bombing had been disrupted, then the industry could have pumped out 25% more weapons, and that could have that I don't think that in itself would have been decisive, but it certainly would have been. But if there was a large fleet of these high-speed, very maneuverable, very agile jet engine fighters, then I think it could have really made a big difference. The other thing that, or two things, I guess, that the German engineers also invented a heat-seeking missile, ground-to-air missile. This was the very first ground-to-air missile ever invented that had this sort of, so it was heat-seeking, so it could be shot at a plane or even a tank for that matter, and it would seek out the heat signature and then take out if those could have been produced in quantity, that could have been decisive. But again, they fiddle-faffed because they didn't have enough bandwidth in the production facility to say, well, let's do all of these things and see how they go. They had to make a decision. Well, we're either going to do this or that. We're going to do these heat-seeking missiles, but then we can't produce the anti-aircraft guns. So decisions had to be made and trade-offs. I think those heat-seeking missiles could have actually been decisive and produced in significant quantity. It could have completely eroded the Red Army advantage in tank numbers, for example, or on any battlefront. It could have made a decisive difference against tanks and aircraft, or even heavy field artillery, because they generate a lot of heat with shooting those shells out. So that could have been, and the Germans could have produced considerable numbers at that point. So those two things were, or those technical innovations, but in the end they didn't do the heat-seeking missile, ground-to-air missiles, or ground-to-ground. And by the time Hitler had made a decision on the fighters, they simply weren't produced in sufficient quantities to, and also the different engines. The jet engine had to be different if it was going to be a bomber than if it was just a fighter, and depending on the payload it would carry and the like. So opportunities were squandered there. Hitler was criticised for not being far-sighted enough and imaginative enough to see the benefit of these things. But we also need to realise Hitler quickly saw the benefit of how to structure the armoured divisions, how the tank should be organised, how they could be used and deployed, the coordination with aircraft. Hitler saw all of those things, so he was quite a visionary in that sense. But so to say, well, he saw all that, but because he didn't understand the benefit of a jet fighter, that means he was a raving moron. So that's not, to balance it out. He was. Hitler was one of the first world leader of a major industrial nation to actually understand how the combination of arms could be deployed for decisive advantage on the ground, and none of the others, as in none, saw it. So he was very much ahead of his time in the conduct of modern warfare. Did he miss the thing or not take full advantage of the jet engine once it's there? Well, he did, but not that he didn't see the advantage of it, but he perceived it as a bomber instead of a fighter, when really, and some of this is with hindsight, but when really the fighter was the thing, and the advice he was being given by the senior advisors around him was stick with the fighter, but he refused to accept that. Now, there's a few other things too. The war in the East, that is the Eastern Front, with the Soviet Union and the Red Army. Hitler's widely criticised for constantly interfering with the troop movements and withdrawals, and saying that the troops should stand fast and inflict as many casualties on the Red Army as they could. Now, Hitler was looking at the thing that the casualties already inflicted in the Red Army were even at that stage were pushing 7 million, and so Hitler was of the view that, hey, these guys have just got to fall over exhausted any minute now. Now, that had been an attitude they'd had for some time, even when it was around Stalingrad. Hitler was throwing that one around. That, look, these guys have suffered so many casualties, lost so much territory, lost so much war material that they really, they're just going to collapse and fall over at any minute. And he still was holding on to that view even in 1944, probably more so given the casualties were inflicted. Now, as much as there were Wehrmacht defeats in the East, the defeat was measured on the basis, did the Wehrmacht quit that territory? It was therefore a defeat, which is often a classic way of viewing who won the battle. Whoever vacated the field was the loser, that sort of thing. But the losses that the Red Army was sustaining, they were prepared to accept huge losses in gaining these victories. So, say, for example, in one battle that's touted as a great victory and German army destroyed and all this sort of stuff, the Wehrmacht lost 60,000 men compared to the Russians' 140,000 men. So, and yet that's slated. So Hitler's looking at these numbers and saying, hey, we're losing on this, but they're losing much more. Every victory they achieve is a Pyrrhic victory, where they're incurring losses much greater than ours. Now, this was something that maybe Hitler didn't sort of understand. The Red Army had vast amounts of oil that the Wehrmacht did not have, so they could afford to have a wide, broad battlefront with trucks and tanks all over the place, whereas the Wehrmacht could really only actively defend one sector of that broad front. So now there were, their expert defense generals like Model and so on the Wehrmacht side that took a heavy toll of all the Red Army attacks. But the Red Army tactics of putting pressure across a broad front and waiting for something to crack, and because they had so many American trucks and tanks with oil, they could then exploit wherever the break in the front was. But they had prepared to sustain vast losses. Even when the war was nearly over and the final assaults on downtown Berlin, the Red Army still lost something like 30,000 soldiers, and the war was almost fucking over. So Hitler was looking at this exchange of losses, saying, look, these guys are losing so much. Similarly, the Panzerfaust and various other weapons that are coming online were taking a very heavy toll of the Russian tanks. The T-34, as heavily armored as that tank was. Now, the quality, because they were popping out, the production rate of these tanks was increasing, but the quality of production was declining. So even though the rated speed was 50 kilometers an hour, or 45 to 50 kilometers an hour in the T-34, it was so badly made that even at 15 or 20 kilometers an hour, the operators were having to stop the tanks every hour or two because they were overheating. Then they had to sit idle for a few hours to cool down and then go again. So it wasn't as if every tank could be operational at every time and operating to full spec. And this was something, again, that the Wehrmacht and the intelligence advisors to Hitler had pointed out. So he thought, well, given that the losses that the Soviets, the Red Army are taking, they're still likely to fall over at any minute. And that was not unreasonable. That was quite a reasonable assumption to make. The losses were horrendous. Stalin was completely prepared to accept those losses as a price of ultimate and final victory, and especially with Stalin's perception that everybody who was killed was a potential counter-revolutionary. So the more people were killed, the more the Russian society was being cleansed of possible miscreants and so on, which is an incredible attitude to take. But there you go. So those were among Hitler's considerations. A final consideration was there were intelligence reports were that there was a lot of disputes between the British Americans, particularly the British and the Soviets. Churchill was quite reasonably very concerned that the Soviets would penetrate Eastern Europe and would take over the governments there and install puppet communist governments, which is exactly what they did. So Churchill was quite far-sighted on that. Similarly, Goebbels and some of his people in Germany were also warning of that at the same time. We're saying, hey, you guys in the West, the Russians do come in, the Soviets, Soviet Union, the communists do come into the Eastern Europe, that they will take over there. Don't think they're going to leave. That they won't. They'll install communist governments there, which is exactly what happened. So Hitler took the view that the Allies may fall out, and there may be such disputes and disagreements that they would fall out or reach such a state of disagreement they effectively would stop putting resources into the fighting and would cut some sort of a deal with Hitler. So and Hitler was going back to the days of Frederick the Great and the 7 Years' War, when Prussia looked like it was about to be defeated, but at the last minute, a leader died here, or there was a shift in view and attitude and so on by those that were against Prussia, and that saved Prussia from complete invasion. So when Roosevelt died, for example, Franklin Roosevelt, President of the US, died, Hitler thought, mate, is that an omen? Is this going to be a situation where the Allies fall out when Harry Truman becomes president? Anyway, that didn't happen, but that was equally a consideration. Hitler was watching how the British and Americans and Canadians were really struggling in spite of their overwhelming superiority in the invasion coming through France into Germany, and figured they could be beaten, and it came very close with, again, the Battle of the Bulge. But overall, when we look at all of these considerations that Hitler was looking at, we said, well, it's pretty far-fetched. At this stage, Hitler was under a vast amount of stress and pressure, and did become erratic. And if the bad news was coming in too thick and fast, he'd have fits of fancy. I mean, he'd get angry and aggressive and start condemning people around him. But if you look at when Churchill and Stalin were under a lot of stress, when they look like they're about to be invaded, it wasn't dissimilar, the behaviour of anyone under that sort of stress. I've seen it in business. I remember a CEO that I was talking to, I'd come to meet, and he was under so much stress at the time, he fell on the floor and had a fit, and was just sort of writhing around on the floor, gurgling and so on. And he had a personal assistant and a sort of a deputy personal assistant, two women, and they just came into the room and they kind of sat on him and just kept him there. And I was looking, I must have been a horrified look on my face, and they just looked up and said, look, don't worry, make another appointment time. It's not going to happen, right? So people under a great deal of stress, whether it be in political or military or in business, sometimes they'll crack, if not momentarily. But the stress of having to make so many decisions, and as things go worse and worse, your trust and faith in the people around you becomes less, and therefore the stress increases and so on. So Hitler was clearly in that position, but most of the time, according to the people who used to come in, he was reasonably lucid and reasonably sensible, but was clearly on the downhill slope in terms of the stress getting to him and becoming more erratic as a result of that stress. So overall, what Was Hitler's position, totally insane or ridiculous? Well, not really. What his and again, this was information we given to him, but his view that the Red Army, the Soviets, the communist armies coming from the east, they were having to take a lot of casualties to get the victories they were winning, and in not every single engagement, but in the majority of engagements, they were losing far more in men and materiel than the Wehrmacht was. So Hitler was reasonable. It was quite reasonable to say, look, these guys can't keep this up forever. At some point, they've got to fall over. They didn't manage to fall over though before the end of the war. So had Hitler been managed to prolong the war for another 12 months, so then that might have happened, but not in the time frame that the war was running to. In terms of the jet fighter, I think the jet fighter would have been decisive. The German war machine at the time did have enough resources to produce a significant number of jet fighters and the heat-guided missiles. Had they produced both of those in quantity when they could have, at the earliest they could have done this was probably April or May 1943. No, late 1943, early 1944. They could have done this. I think that would have been decisive, and they could have possibly turned the war around at that point. And if they could have gained control of the skies over Germany, then weapons production would have increased by 25% plus, and they could have destroyed the Soviet or any other numerical superiority in heavy artillery and tanks and that sort of stuff. And that, I think, could have been decisive. Whether it would have turned it around completely or not, that's harder to say. But I believe it could have been. So to say, well, Hitler was a madman relying on stuff that was just on the drawing board. No, it was further ahead, further advanced than that. We've gone through testing and prototyping and all that sort of stuff. So, excuse me. So I think that could have been decisive. So all in all, this idea that the war could have been won at that stage, it wasn't insane, or it wasn't. It certainly was unlikely and improbable, no question of that. But it wasn't delusional, and had Hitler acted quickly and decisively. Bear in mind, he's making decisions in real time. It's easy for anyone to look back and go, well, he should have done this and should have done that. That's easy to do. But at the time, with all the stresses and all the things that are going on, it's much more difficult to make those decisions, particularly when you've got an option. You have to stop producing this in order to produce that. That particularly would have complicated things. But had Hitler acted decisively at the time with that jet fighter and with the heat-seeking missiles, and that they'd started to produce those in quantity, I think it would have turned things around. But or at the very least, elongated the war by 18 months to 2 years. You've been a taskmaster today. Your pushback, Sharon, and thank you for listening.